Rome, night of the 12th to the 13th of October, in the year 54 of our era. In the gloom of the imperial chambers of the Palatine, amidst the sweet aroma of the Falerno wine and the perfumed smoke of the oil lamps, lies on his bed, writhing in excruciating pain, the man who governs the destinies of the vast Roman Empire. Tiberius Claudius Drusus, Nero Germanicus, the fourth emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the stammering and lame scholar whom no one expected to see girded with the imperial purple, is consumed in an agony that seems to have no end. His face, usually pale and good-natured, is now unhinged with suffering, his eyes wild with terror, and from his throat, which had so often struggled to articulate speeches before the Senate, only choked groans and agonizing rails now escape. The apparent cause of his torment, a plate of mushrooms, his favorite delicacy, served at dinner the night before. But was it really a tragic culinary accident, an unfortunate indigestion caused by a misidentified wild mushroom? Or was it, as many suspected from the outset, and as history has tended to confirm, the result of a coldly calculated crime, of a lethal poison skillfully administered to that plate of mushrooms by expert hands and with unmistakable intent? And if so, who or who was behind that covert regicide? The eyes, full of fear and suspicion, inevitably turned to an imposing, ambitious, and unscrupulous female figure. His fourth and last wife, the Empress Agrippina the Younger, sister of the infamous Caligula, mother of the young Nero, and a woman ready to do anything, absolutely anything, to ensure the ascent to the throne of her own son, even at the cost of the life of her imperial husband. The death of Claudius, the emperor who had conquered Britain, and who had ruled with a mixture of erudition, clumsiness, and surprising administrative efficiency, would not only open the gates of power to the monster that would become Nero, it would also leave behind a trail of doubts, suspicions, and questions that have fascinated and disturbed historians for almost 2 millennia. This is the chronicle of a fatal dinner, the story of the last and agonizing days of an unexpected emperor, and the mystery that still shrouds his death, a death that smells of poison, of unbridled ambition, and the dark and lethal palace intrigue that characterized the Rome of the Caesars. Join me in unraveling the secrets of that deadly mushroom dish, in exploring the complex personality of Claudius and his fearsome wife Agrippina, and in trying to discern whether the Grim Reaper acted alone that October night, or whether he had very human and very self-interested help. Accident or murder? The question, like a lingering shadow, continues to hover over the tomb of Emperor Claudius. To understand in all its depth and complexity the circumstances surrounding the suspicious and tragic death of Emperor Claudius, and to understand the motivations of those possibly involved in his demise, it is absolutely essential that we first immerse ourselves in the convulsive, fascinating, and often terrifying world of Imperial Rome in the 1st century AD, and in the no less complex and contradictory personality of Claudius himself. Tiberius Claudius Drusus Nero Germanicus was born in Lugdunum, present-day Lyon in Gaul, on the 1st of August of the year 10 before Christ. He belonged by direct lineage to the highest Roman aristocracy and to the Julio-Claudian imperial family itself. He was the son of Drusus the Elder, one of the most brilliant and popular generals of his time, brother of the future emperor Tiberius, and stepson of Augustus himself. His mother was Antonia the Younger, daughter of Mark Antony and Octavia, Augustus's sister. Despite such illustrious ancestry, Claudius's childhood and youth were marked by misfortune, illness, and the scorn of his own family. As a child, he suffered from a series of physical ailments, limpness, stuttering, tremors, a certain motor clumsiness, that made him an object of ridicule and embarrassment to those around him. His grandmother Livia, Augustus's influential wife, considered him mentally deficient. His own mother, Antonia, called him a monster half-made by nature, and openly despised him. Even the Emperor Augustus, while sometimes showing some sympathy for him, considered him unfit for any kind of public or military career, and deliberately kept him away from the honors and responsibilities befitting his rank. Marginalized and ridiculed, Claudius found refuge in study and scholarship. He became an accomplished historian, philologist, and antiquarian, writing numerous works, most of which are now unfortunately lost, on the history of Rome, the Etruscans and Carthage, as well as treatises on the Latin alphabet and the game of dice. His intelligence and culture were remarkable, but his contemporaries, blinded by his physical defects and the prejudices of the time, rarely recognized them. During the reigns of Augustus, Tiberius, and above all, of the bloodthirsty and insane Caligula, his own nephew, Claudius lived a dark, precarious, and often dangerous existence, always under the shadow of suspicion and imperial caprice. He survived the purges and conspiracies thanks, precisely, to that image of a harmless and sickly fool that his family and the court had formed of him. No one considered him a threat, no one took him seriously, and that, paradoxically, saved his life on more than one occasion. The situation changed radically and unexpectedly in January of the year 41 of our era. After the assassination of Caligula by a group of Praetorian Guard officers and conspiratorial senators, a brief but intense period of chaos and power vacuum was unleashed in Rome. The Senate, yearning to restore the Republic, or at least elect an emperor to its liking, deliberated without reaching an agreement. Meanwhile, the Praetorians, fearing to lose their privileges or to be punished for the assassination of Caligula, were desperately looking for a candidate to the throne who would be favorable to them and who would guarantee their impunity. It was then, according to the almost tragicomic account of ancient historians such as Suetonius, that Praetorian soldiers found Claudius, then in his 50s, hiding and trembling with fear behind curtains in the imperial palace. Instead of killing him, as he surely feared, they surprisingly hailed him as the new emperor, perhaps because he was the only surviving adult male member of the Julio-Claudian family, perhaps because they considered him a tractable and grateful candidate, or perhaps simply because there was no better choice in that moment of confusion. The Senate, faced with the strength of the Praetorian legions, had no choice but to reluctantly ratify the election. And so, in the most improbable and almost accidental manner, the stammering and lame scholar, the man who had been despised and marginalized all his life, became Tiberius Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, Emperor of Rome. His ascension to the throne was greeted with a mixture of surprise, skepticism, and in some circles, outright hostility. Many senators considered him a puppet of the Praetorians, a weak man incapable of governing the vast and complex Roman Empire. However, Claudius, despite his physical peculiarities and lack of previous political experience, proved to be a surprisingly capable, hard-working, and in many respects, effective emperor. During his 13-year reign, from 41 to 54 AD, he carried out important administrative, judicial, and financial reforms. He promoted public works, building new aqueducts, roads, and the port of Ostia. He expanded the empire, annexing new provinces such as Mauritania, Thrace, and above all, Britannia, a conquest that gave him great military prestige. He was concerned with justice, personally presiding over numerous trials, and with the welfare of the provinces. He tried to restore the authority of the Senate, although he often clashed with the arrogance and corruption of many of its members. However, his reign was also marked by palace intrigues, by the excessive influence of his freedmen, freed slaves who occupied high positions in the imperial administration, such as Narcissus, Pallas, and Callisto, generating the resentment of the traditional nobility, and, most especially, by his disastrous marital choices. Claudius married 4 times, and his last 2 wives, Messalina and Agrippina the Younger, would go down in history as 2 of the most ambitious, depraved, and bloodthirsty women of imperial Rome. Valeria Messalina, his 3rd wife, famous for her insatiable sexual appetite and cruelty, repeatedly cheated on him, conspired against him, and was finally executed in 48 AD after a scandal of capital proportions. Her fall left a vacuum that would soon be filled by an even more fearsome and calculating figure, Agrippina the Younger. Agrippina, carnal niece of Claudius, daughter of his brother Germanicus, and sister of the late Caligula, was a woman of stunning beauty, keen intelligence, and boundless political ambition. Widowed and with a son from a previous marriage, the young Lucius Domitius Aenobarbus, the future Nero, Agrippina saw in the marriage with her uncle Claudius, a man already old and in poor health, the perfect opportunity to attain supreme power, and above all, to ensure the ascent to the throne of her own son, to the detriment of Britannicus, the son that Claudius had had with Messalina, and who was the natural heir. To achieve her goal, Agrippina did not hesitate to use every means at her disposal: seduction, intrigue, manipulation, and, if necessary, crime. In 49 AD, after obtaining a special dispensation from the Senate to marry her uncle, a marriage considered incestuous by Roman law, Agrippina became the new empress. From the first moment, she exerted an enormous and growing influence over Claudius, who, according to some historians, was deeply in love with her, or, perhaps more likely, feared her, and was dominated by her strong personality. Agrippina devoted herself with zeal to consolidating her own position and paving the way for Nero's succession. She succeeded in getting Claudius to formally adopt Nero in 50 AD, effectively putting him before her own son Britannicus. He got Nero to marry Octavia, the daughter of Claudius and Messalina, thus strengthening his ties with the imperial family. And he surrounded himself with a circle of loyal allies, such as the prefect of the Praetorium Afranius Donkey and the philosopher Seneca, whom he had recalled from exile to become Nero's tutor, while systematically eliminating all those who might oppose his plans, either by exile, confiscation of property, or, according to rumor, poison. The first omens of a tragic end for Claudius began to accumulate as the emperor's health, never robust, began to decline, and as Nero, already an ambitious and impatient teenager, approached the age of assuming power. Agrippina knew that her position and that of her son depended entirely on Claudius's life, but also on his not changing his mind at the last moment and deciding to favor Britannicus. It was rumored that Claudius, in his last months, was beginning to regret having marginalized his natural son and that he planned to restore him to his inheritance rights. If this was true, the emperor's life was in imminent danger. A symbolic object, a will that Claudius might have secretly drafted favoring Britannicus, or perhaps a plate of mushrooms, his favorite delicacy, would become the key elements of a drama that was about to reach its bloody climax. The enigma of Claudius's madness, often magnified by his enemies, was now intertwined with the much darker enigma of his possible assassination. Would Agrippina be capable of going to such lengths to secure Nero's future? The answer, for many ancient and modern historians, is a resounding yes. The downward spiral that would lead Emperor Claudius from absolute power on the Palatine to his deathbed, and a death shrouded in the most sinister suspicions, was a process that accelerated in a dizzying manner in the last years of his reign, coinciding with his marriage to the ambitious and fearsome Agrippina the Less, and with the progressive rise of his stepson, the young Nero. As Claudius's health, never particularly robust and afflicted with various chronic ailments, began to decline more obviously, and as Nero approached adulthood and the possibility of assuming power, the tension in the imperial palace became increasingly palpable, almost unbreathable. Agrippina, aware that her own position, and above all, her son's imperial future, depended entirely on the will of an aging, infirm, and often impressionable emperor, was relentless in her efforts to consolidate Nero's power and to remove any obstacle that might stand in his way to the throne. The main threat to Agrippina's plans was undoubtedly Britannicus, the son Claudius had had with his previous wife, the infamous Messalina. Although Britannicus was still a child, some 3 or 4 years younger than Nero, he was the emperor's biological son, and therefore in the eyes of many Romans, and especially the conservative Senate, the natural and legitimate heir to the throne. Nero, on the other hand, was only the adopted son of Claudius, and his rise was due entirely to the influence and machinations of his mother. Agrippina knew that, as long as Britannicus lived, and as long as Claudius retained a modicum of decision-making capacity, there was always the risk that the emperor, in a moment of lucidity or repentance, would change his will and designate his natural son as his successor, thus upsetting all her plans. Therefore, one of Agrippina's priorities was to undermine Britannicus's position, to remove him from his father's favor, and to surround him with a hostile environment and constant vigilance. She saw to it that Britannicus's tutors and servants were people she trusted, that they discredited him before Claudius and reported all his movements. At the same time, he vigorously promoted the image of Nero as a virtuous young man, talented and prepared to assume the highest responsibilities of the state, thanks to the careful education he received from such prestigious teachers as the philosopher Seneca and the prefect of the Praetorium Afranioburo, both allies of Agrippina. Meanwhile, Claudius's health continued to deteriorate. He suffered from frequent digestive problems, weakness in his legs, tremors, and according to some accounts, episodes of mental confusion or memory loss. Although he continued to attend to affairs of state with his usual diligence and erudition, his physical capacity and stamina were visibly diminishing. The court physicians, among whom was the famous Xenophon of Cos, a Greek of great reputation who enjoyed the emperor's confidence, tried to alleviate his ailments with the limited resources of the medicine of the time. But their treatments, diets, baths, massages, herbal remedies, had a merely palliative effect. In this context of the emperor's physical decline and the growing impatience of Agrippina and Nero, rumors began to circulate insistently about possible attempts to poison him or about the manipulation of Claudius's medical treatments. It was said that Agrippina, with the help of some of her trusted freedmen, and perhaps with the complicity of some unscrupulous physician, was administering to the emperor substances that were slowly undermining his health or affecting his mental lucidity. These accusations, although difficult to prove, found fertile ground in the atmosphere of intrigue and distrust that reigned in the imperial palace, where poison was a sadly frequent political weapon. One of the key characters in this plot of suspicions was the famous poisoner Locusta, an expert in the art of intoxicants, who, according to the historians Tacitus and Suetonius, was hired by Agrippina to prepare the poison that would end Claudius's life. Locusta, who had already been implicated in other notorious crimes, thus became the material instrument of the empress's designs. The choice of the poison and the method of administration required great cunning, since it had to appear to be a natural or accidental death, and not arouse too much suspicion. Mushrooms, a favorite delicacy of Claudius, an emperor known for his gluttony, were the perfect vehicle for the poison. A plate of exquisite mushrooms, perhaps of the Amanita phalloides variety, known for its high toxicity and for causing severe gastrointestinal symptoms followed by liver and kidney failure, or perhaps edible mushrooms to which were added a more potent and faster-acting poison, such as arsenic or aconite. The worsening conflict between Claudius and Agrippina, or at least Agrippina's growing determination to secure the throne for Nero before it was too late, became more evident in the months leading up to the emperor's death. The story is told that Claudius, in some moments of lucidity or regret at having marginalized his son Britannicus, expressed his intention to modify his will or to take steps to protect the rights of his natural son. These intentions, if they reached Agrippina's ears, must have set off all the alarms and precipitated her criminal plans. The historian Tacitus, one of our main sources for this period, although often hostile to the Julio-Claudian dynasty, recounts in detail the machinations of Agrippina and the growing anguish of Claudius. According to Tacitus, the emperor, aware perhaps of the danger he was in, began to show renewed affection for Britannicus, embracing him in public and lamenting his misfortune. These displays of paternal affection only increased Agrippina's urgency. An internal hook in this plot could be the partial revelation of an alleged earlier plot against Claudius, or the mention of a particularly suspicious physician or servant in the emperor's entourage whose actions or loyalties were ambiguous. For example, the role of the physician Xenophon of Cos, who, according to some accounts, would have been in charge of administering the final remedy to Claudius when the initial poison from the mushrooms did not prove to be fast or lethal enough. Was Xenophon an accomplice of Agrippina, or simply a physician who, in his desperate attempt to alleviate the emperor's suffering, administered a substance that unknowingly hastened his death? Claudius's own despair, paranoia, or denial of the conspiracy that was being woven around him is difficult to determine. Ancient sources often present him as a naive man, easily manipulated by his wives and freedmen, or as a distracted scholar oblivious to court intrigues. However, there are also indications that Claudius was a shrewd politician and a born survivor who had managed to weather the perils of the reigns of Tiberius and Caligula. It is possible that, in his last months, he was aware of the danger posed by Agrippina, but felt too old, too ill, or too isolated to be able to counter her machinations. Or perhaps, as some have suggested, he underestimated his wife's ruthlessness and determination, believing that his love for her or his position as emperor would protect him. Be that as it may, the downward spiral had closed in on him, and the poison, whether literal or metaphorical, was about to do its work. The shadow of the executioner, embodied in the implacable and cunning figure of Agrippina the Younger, and in the invisible poison of a carefully prepared venom, loomed ever denser and more menacingly over the Emperor Claudius in that autumn of the year 54. His physical deterioration, though fluctuating, was progressive, and his ability to control the levers of power was undermined not only by his ailments, but also by the growing influence of his wife, and by the unstoppable rise of his stepson Nero, who had already turned 16 and had been invested with the virile toga, a sign of his coming of age and his aptitude to assume public responsibilities. The atmosphere in the imperial palace on the Palatine was one of almost unbreathable tension, a mixture of court intrigues, barely concealed fears, and morbid expectation before the foreseeable, and for some, desired end of the emperor. The descriptions that have come down to us of Claudius's physical and mental state in his last months are, as usual in ancient sources, often contradictory and tinged by the intentionality of the authors. For those who wanted to justify his elimination or the rise of Nero, Claudius was already a decrepit, senile old man, dominated by his freedmen and his wives, incapable of ruling with firmness and lucidity. His physical defects were exaggerated, his limp, his stuttering, his tremors, and extravagant or ridiculous behaviors were attributed to him, supposedly demonstrating his mental derangement. For others, however, Claudius retained, despite his infirmities, a remarkable intellectual capacity, an admirable erudition, and a sense of justice that led him to take an interest in state affairs and to preside personally over the courts. His isolation, rather than a symptom of madness, could have been a consequence of his growing distrust of a hostile court environment and his desire to avoid intrigues and pressures. The reactions of the court, the imperial family, and the people of Rome to the prospect of the emperor's death were complex and varied. At court, many senators and nobles of the old aristocracy, who had always despised Claudius for his origin, they considered him an upstart despite his Julio-Claudian lineage, and for his supposed weakness, eagerly awaited a change of regime, perhaps trusting that a young emperor like Nero would be more manageable or more respectful of the Senate's prerogatives. Others, however, feared Agrippina's overweening ambition and Nero's inexperience and unpredictability. Among the imperial family, tension was at its highest. Agrippina, as we have seen, worked tirelessly to secure her son's succession, while the supporters of Britannicus, Claudius's natural son, though silenced and marginalized, harbored perhaps a last, desperate hope that the emperor, in a last act of justice, would designate him as his heir. The people of Rome in general felt for Claudius a moderate affection, mixed with a certain condescension for his oddities. They appreciated his concern for the supply of the city, his public works and his spectacles, but they also mocked his physical defects and his supposed naivety. His death, if not accompanied by riots or a violent succession crisis, would probably not be mourned with the same intensity as that of an Augustus or a Germanicus. Claudius's last desperate attempts to save himself, to redeem himself before posterity, or to resist Agrippina's plans, if there were any, are difficult to discern among the tangle of rumors, propaganda, and silences surrounding his last days. Some sources suggest, as already mentioned, that the emperor, aware of the danger he was in and regretting having marginalized his son Britannicus, began to show him renewed affection and to hint at his intention to name him his co-heir along with Nero, or even to put him before the latter. It is related that, on one occasion, he embraced Britannicus and said to him, "Grow up quickly, my son, so that you may call me to account for my deeds." These words, if they were really uttered, and if they reached Agrippina's ears, must have sounded like a death sentence for Claudius himself. The impending clock of his fate sped up dramatically. Agrippina understood that she could wait no longer, that any hesitation or delay could jeopardize all her plans and her son's future. The time to act had come. The stage for the last act of the tragedy was set. All that remained was to choose the right poison and the right occasion. And that occasion presented itself on the night of October 12th, 54, during a dinner at the imperial palace. Claudius, as was his custom, indulged with fruition in the pleasures of the table. Among the delicacies served to him was a dish of mushrooms, one of his favorites, seemingly harmless mushrooms, but which, by all accounts, carried within them the germ of death. In describing this moment of apparent calm, this dinner that would precede the agony, it is impossible not to feel the anticipation of the fatal blow, the palpable tension of a crime about to be committed. Did Claudius notice any strange taste in the mushrooms? Did he suspect something in Agrippina's gaze, or in the nervousness of the servants? The sources do not tell us. We only know that a few hours after that dinner, his terrible and definitive agony would begin. The shadow of the executioner, with the smiling and ambiguous face of his own wife, had hovered over him in the most intimate and lethal way. The last night of Emperor Claudius, the night between the fateful banquet of October 12th and his death in the early hours of October 13th in the year 54 of our era, was a nightmare of physical pain, mental anguish, and agony that, according to the accounts of ancient historians, lasted for endless hours, plunging the imperial palace into an atmosphere of horror, intrigue, and an expectant and guilty silence. The narration of those last terrible moments, although tinged by the inevitable bias of the sources and by the inherent drama of a regicide, allows us to glimpse with an overwhelming rawness the climax of a conspiracy meticulously hatched and executed with implacable coldness. After dinner, at which Claudius, with his proverbial appetite, had consumed a generous portion of his favorite dish, mushrooms, a delicacy that, according to the poet Juvenal, Agrippina had offered him with her own hands, although this is probably poetic license to underline his guilt. The emperor retired to his quarters, perhaps already feeling somewhat indisposed, but without suspecting the gravity of what was coming. The poison, probably a toxin extracted from poisonous fungi such as Amanita phalloides, or perhaps a mineral compound such as arsenic, skillfully mixed with the edible mushrooms by the expert hand of the poisoner Locusta, under the direct supervision of Agrippina, began to take effect insidiously but inexorably. The first symptoms, according to Tacitus and Suetonius, were violent abdominal pains, nausea, and uncontrollable vomiting. Claudius, already suffering from chronic digestive problems, perhaps initially attributed his discomfort to simple indigestion, overeating, or drinking. However, as the hours passed, the symptoms worsened alarmingly. The pains became unbearable, wrenching. Diarrhea added to the vomiting, causing rapid dehydration and extreme exhaustion. The emperor, pale as the dead, bathed in a cold, clammy sweat, writhed in his bed, seized by convulsions and excruciating suffering. The court physicians, led by his personal physician, Xenophon of Cos, were called in as a matter of urgency. They applied the usual remedies for these cases: emetics to provoke vomiting and expel the supposed poison, enemas, soothing poultices, medicinal infusions. But nothing seemed to alleviate the agony of the emperor. His condition worsened by the minute, and the suspicion of poisoning began to spread like wildfire through the corridors of the palace. Agrippina, meanwhile, staged a scene of the perfect grieving wife, showing a supposed concern and heart-rending grief for her husband's condition, but without leaving his side for a moment, controlling who entered and left the imperial room, and making sure that no one could interfere with her plans. According to some accounts, when it appeared that the initial poison was not fast or lethal enough, and fearing that Claudius might recover, or worse, have time to change his will and disinherit Nero, Agrippina decided to resort to a more expeditious method. With the complicity of Xenophon of Cos, who, according to Tacitus, would have been bribed or threatened by the empress, a feather smeared with a faster-acting poison was inserted into the emperor's throat, on the pretext of helping him to vomit. This second poison, perhaps based on aconite or some other fulminating substance, would have been the one that finally ended Claudius's life. The death scene must have been dreadful. The emperor, in his last moments of lucidity, if he had any, must have been aware of the betrayal and the horror of his situation. His last words, if he could utter any coherent ones in the midst of that torment, were lost forever, or were conveniently silenced by his assassins. Suetonius tells a macabre anecdote. It is said that, when Claudius was already in his final throes, Agrippina covered him with warm clothes, pretending that he was cold and needed rest, to hide his death for a few hours. while she and her allies ensured Nero's succession and took all necessary measures to prevent any opposition. The exact moment of Claudius's death is placed in the early hours of the morning of October 13th, 54. His agony, according to the sources, would have lasted about 12 hours, a night of terror and suffering that put an end to his 13 years of reign. The immediate atmosphere after his death was confirmed was one of extreme tension, but also of feverish and stealthy activity on the part of Agrippina and her collaborators. The doors of the palace were closed, the guard was doubled, and contradictory communiques on the emperor's state of health were issued in order to gain time and prepare the ground for the proclamation of Nero. The revelation of Claudius's death and the subsequent ascension of Nero to the throne would mark the beginning of one of the most infamous and bloody reigns in the history of Rome, a reign that, paradoxically, had been made possible thanks to the crime hidden in a plate of mushrooms and the unbridled ambition of a mother willing to do anything for the power of her son. The mystery about the exact details of the poisoning, about the identity of all the accomplices, and about the degree of participation of Nero himself, then only 17 years old, would continue to fuel the debate and the fascination of historians for centuries. But the general conclusion, both in antiquity and today, is that Claudius did not die a natural death, but was the victim of a carefully planned and executed political assassination, a crime that, although never officially investigated or punished, had far-reaching consequences for the fate of the Roman Empire. The official announcement of the death of the Emperor Claudius, though it inevitably came after hours of calculated delay and feverish preparations on the part of Agrippina and her closest circle, fell like a thunderbolt upon the city of Rome, and, as the news spread, upon the vast provinces of the empire. Although the emperor's health had been precarious in his last years and his death was not entirely unexpected, the suspicious circumstances surrounding his agony and the speed with which Nero was proclaimed as his successor immediately fueled rumors of foul play, of a poisoning plotted in the highest echelons of power. The reaction of the court and the Senate was, as was to be expected in an autocratic regime where flattery and fear were rife, a mixture of official mourning, protocol expressions of condolence, and hasty adherence to the new emperor. Many senators, who privately despised or feared Claudius, and who perhaps harbored hopes of greater influence under a young and inexperienced prince like Nero, hopes that would soon be brutally dashed, rushed to pay homage to the new Caesar and to decree divine honors for the deceased emperor. Claudius, the man who had been ridiculed for his lameness and stuttering, was officially deified by the Senate, becoming the Divus Claudius, an honor that, however, would soon become the subject of mockery and satire, as in the famous Apocolocyntosis, or Calabassification of Claudius, attributed to Seneca, where the late emperor is grotesquely and humiliatingly portrayed in his attempt to ascend to Olympus. Among the people of Rome, the reaction was more genuine, although perhaps not of such deep sorrow as that which had been aroused by the death of more charismatic figures, such as Germanicus or Augustus. Claudius, despite his oddities, had been an emperor who had been concerned with the supply of the city, the Annona, who had undertaken important public works, and who had offered numerous spectacles and games to entertain the plebs. His death, therefore, was mourned by many as the loss of a relatively benevolent and efficient ruler, and the arrival of an adolescent and unknown emperor like Nero generated a certain uncertainty and apprehension. The fate of Claudius's corpse was the subject of funeral rituals befitting a Roman emperor. His body was embalmed and prepared for the funeral. A state funeral was held with great pomp and solemnity, at which the young Nero delivered a funeral speech, probably written by his tutor Seneca, praising the virtues and achievements of his adoptive father and predecessor. After the public ceremonies, Claudius's remains were cremated on a monumental pyre in the Field of Mars, and his ashes were laid to rest with full honors in the mausoleum of Augustus, the pantheon of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. However, even in these funeral acts, there was no lack of macabre or ironic details that fueled suspicions about the true cause of his death. It is said that Agrippina, during the funeral, could barely conceal her joy and impatience to see her son Nero invested with all the attributes of imperial power. And Claudius's own deification, although formally a supreme honor, was seen by many as a hypocritical farce, a way of silencing consciences and diverting attention from the true circumstances of his end. The immediate political consequences of Claudius's death were, of course, the rise to the throne of Nero, who, at the age of just 17, became the absolute master of the Roman Empire. During the first years of his reign, the so-called Happy Quinquennium, 54-59 AD, Nero ruled under the moderating influence of his mother Agrippina, his tutor Seneca, and the prefect of the Praetorium Afranius Burro, in a period of relative stability and good government. However, the excessive ambition of Agrippina, who intended to continue ruling through her son, and the increasingly authoritarian, capricious, and cruel character of Nero would soon clash, leading to a spiral of intrigues, conspiracies, and crimes that would culminate in the assassination of Agrippina herself by order of her son in 59, and with the subsequent and infamous reign of terror of Nero. The fate of Britannicus, Claudius's natural son and Nero's main potential rival, was also sealed with the death of his father. Although Nero initially treated him with apparent cordiality, Britannicus still posed a threat to his power. Just a few months after Nero's accession, in 55 AD, Britannicus was poisoned to death at a banquet, in circumstances that pointed directly to the new emperor and his mother. With his death, the last dynastic obstacle to the consolidation of Nero's power disappeared. The new questions that arose after the death of Claudius, or rather the confirmation of the suspicions that already existed, revolved around the degree of involvement of each of the main actors in the alleged poisoning. Was Agrippina the sole instigator and executor of the crime? Did she have the active complicity of her trusted freedmen, such as Pallas? What was the exact role of the physician Xenophon of Cos? And what did the young Nero know or suspect of his mother's plans? Although ancient sources are unanimous in pointing to Agrippina as the main culprit, the degree of knowledge or involvement of other characters remains a matter of debate. What does seem clear is that Claudius's death was a perfectly executed crime of state, allowing for a relatively smooth transition of power to Nero, at least in appearance and at first. The impending chaos that could have resulted from an open struggle for the succession between Nero and Britannicus was thus avoided, but at a terrible price. That of a regicide that would set a disastrous precedent and would mark with a bloodstain the beginning of one of the most infamous reigns in the history of Rome. The death of Emperor Claudius, shrouded in the mystery of deadly mushrooms and the ominous shadow of Agrippina's ambition, was not just another episode in the convulsive chronicle of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. His end, whether accidental or provoked, had profound and lasting repercussions on the future of the Roman Empire, and his legacy, like that of so many other Caesars, is a complex mixture of lights and shadows, of remarkable achievements and human miseries. Despite his physical defects, his apparent clumsiness, and the often caricatured image of him conveyed by some ancient historians hostile to his figure, Claudius was, in many respects, a surprisingly effective emperor and a diligent administrator. During his 13 years of rule, the Roman Empire experienced a period of relative internal stability and territorial expansion. The conquest of Britain, a major military enterprise that his predecessors had not dared to undertake or had failed to complete, was one of his greatest achievements and brought him considerable military glory. He also annexed other important provinces such as Mauritania, Thrace, and Lycia, consolidating the borders of the empire and increasing its resources. Domestically, Claudius was concerned with improving the administration of justice, often presiding personally over the courts and showing a certain inclination towards equity and clemency, although he was also capable of great cruelty when he felt threatened. He promoted important public works that improved the infrastructure of the empire, such as the construction of new aqueducts to supply water to Rome, the Aqua Claudia and the Anio Novus, the enlargement and improvement of the port of Ostia, essential for the supply of grain to the capital, and the construction of roads and canals. He was also interested in the reform of the Latin alphabet, proposing the introduction of 3 new letters, and in the preservation of ancient Roman and Etruscan traditions, demonstrating an erudition and interest in history that contrasted with the frivolity of some of his predecessors. However, his reign was also marked by negative aspects that tarnished his legacy. The excessive influence of his trusted freedmen, Narcissus, Pallas, Callisto, who accumulated enormous power and wealth, generated deep resentment among the senatorial nobility, who saw them as corrupt and arrogant upstarts. And above all, his disastrous marital choices, especially with Messalina and Agrippina, made him a victim of palace intrigues and ultimately sealed his tragic fate. Claudius's death at the hands of Agrippina, if we accept the version of poisoning, is a paradigmatic example of the brutality and lack of scruples that characterized the struggle for power in imperial Rome. Agrippina's unbridled ambition to secure the throne for her son Nero led her to commit one of the most infamous crimes in history, a regicide that, although perhaps neither the first nor the last in the Rome of the Caesars, had particularly disastrous consequences. Nero's rise to power, facilitated by the death of Claudius, inaugurated a period of increasing tyranny, excesses, and persecutions that would culminate in the Great Fire of Rome, the first organized persecution against Christians, and a civil war that put an end to the Julio-Claudian dynasty. From this perspective, the death of Claudius can be seen as the prelude to one of the darkest and bloodiest eras in the history of Rome. The moral or existential lesson that emerges from Claudius's story is perhaps that of the fragility of power and the vulnerability of the individual, even the most powerful, in the face of human passions such as ambition, envy, and betrayal. Claudius, despite being the emperor of Rome, could not escape the intrigues of his own wife, nor the threat of a poison hidden in his favorite delicacy. His story reminds us that, as Shakespeare would say centuries later, there are daggers in men's smiles, and that often the worst enemies are found in the innermost circle. The question that continues to echo down the centuries is whether history would have been different if Claudius had lived longer, if he had managed to appoint Britannicus as his successor, or if he had been able to control the ambitions of Agrippina and Nero. Would Rome have avoided the horrors of the Neronian reign? Would it have continued the policy of moderation and good government that characterized part of Claudius's reign? These are counterfactual questions that will never be answered, but which invite us to reflect on the role of chance, contingency, and individual decisions in the course of history. And so, the mausoleum of Augustus, where the ashes of Claudius lie next to those of other great emperors, closed not only on the remains of a man, but also on a mystery that continues to fuel imagination and debate. Were deadly mushrooms really the cause of his end, or was it the cold and calculated poison of a wife willing to do anything for power? I invite you to share your own opinion in the comments. Do you think Claudius was a naive victim of Agrippina's ambition? Or was he an emperor who, despite his achievements, failed to protect himself from the intrigues of his own court? And if these chronicles of the most shocking and enigmatic endings of royalty fascinate you and make you think, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, hit like, and join us on our next journey into the depths of history, where there are always new secrets to discover and new lessons to learn.